We are joined today by Christi Buker, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Library Association. How are Pennsylvania's libraries funded?
Thank you for having me and for the opportunity to explain this. I think a lot of folks think that your library is 100% funded with taxpayer money, and in general, it's an important part that is contributed to libraries, but library funding generally comes from state aid, a lot of local municipal support, as well as individual contributions from patrons who use the library or local donors and benefactors. So it is a combination of those funds that make the operations possible for the library. And that is key, that it's not just taxpayer, but it is a lot of local support as well.
How are the finances of the libraries in Pennsylvania currently?
Unfortunately, we have seen declining revenue overall for libraries statewide. And on an individual basis, there may be some individual increases, but the data does tell us that revenue from 2022 to 2023 dropped 2.5 million. And while libraries run very lean, we're seeing this continuing trend of less funds available, and yet libraries are still trying to maintain the same level of operations.
How much funding do libraries get from the state budget annually?
So in last year's state budget, it was 70.47 million in the public libraries subsidy. There are two other line items for the libraries in the budget. That is the library services for visually impaired and disabled, which is a smaller amount, and library access. But individual libraries receive their funding from the public library subsidy, and that was 70.47 million. It's been that way since 2022, but it used to be 75 million back in 2008. So we're still lower than we used to be for overall funding for libraries.
And why do you believe that the funding has lessened over the years?
So on the state level, that initial cut back in 2008 did have to do with the recession that we were facing. But many other items have increased, and we have been working diligently to ask the legislature to give us moderate increases. We did have an increase in 2022, and we had hoped to have some additional steps. At the beginning of this year, we were asking for additional funds to hopefully get back to restored funding at least that 75 million, which doesn't even include any inflationary costs that we've considered as well. But it's obviously there's a lot of demands for things, but we do think libraries are, one, a good use of public funds because we support the entire population here in Pennsylvania of all ages, and two, reading and literacy skills often start at the library. So asking for that funding to be restored is critical. Even on a local level, we are continuing to ask for additional support.
Now, the state budget has been at an impasse for 2 to 3 months now. How has that been impacting libraries?
So that public library subsidy does split out into paying 29 library districts, which help coordinate and offer collaborative services. That payment was supposed to be made in August, and that was 14 million of the 70.47. That hasn't happened. And unfortunately, that is a significant issue because those payments often fund the big one-time purchases for our online databases, for things like Morningstar database, which is a business database. It often funds big software purchases, which are done to get the most cost-effective purchase price. We do it all at once in an annual fee. But if we don't have that state money coming in, libraries can't make it. And so they may have to either delay or try to go on a month-to-month basis, which increases the cost over time.
How is Pennsylvania's library system set up?
So I mentioned the districts. We have 29 library districts, but within Pennsylvania, we have a total of 467 state-aided public libraries. Now, there are some other libraries which are very independent and don't receive state aid, but they're usually very small because they can't meet the standards that are required by the state to receive state funding. So out of those 467 libraries, half of our counties, so about 34 of our 67 counties, have a countywide system. That countywide system, for example, provides coordination. I live in Cumberland County and there are 7 libraries. I can use my library card at any of those 7 libraries, and I can return books at any of those 7 libraries, and they'll be delivered back to the original location. So we have districts, systems, and then we have independent libraries. And about 85% of our public libraries are 501c3 nonprofit charitable organizations that again rely on that local support as well as state aid, because state aid is generally 15 to 18% of their operating budget, but the local support from both municipal contributions as well as individuals really does make the difference for whether a community has a great library or a small library. It depends on the community.
Now, during this impasse, how long would libraries have before the funding reaches critical status?
I mentioned that most libraries are 501c3 organizations, and accountants will tell nonprofits, don't keep too many months in reserve because then you're not giving the money adequately to your mission. You're not just to sit there and hold on to the money. But we've learned our lesson, unfortunately, from past impasses that we need to keep more money available, but libraries just don't have it. Unfortunately, at this point, they're starting to already look at, can they take a loan? But a library taking a loan is not good because there's no way to charge patrons more to recover interest that might be charged on the loan. And whether or not they have any reserves, oftentimes, if they're lucky enough to have an endowment, it may be restricted for only using for building maintenance and not operations. But libraries have tried a bunch of these things when we've had past impasses. And ultimately, at this point, they've learned that they really have to start cutting services to patrons because loans are not really viable. The endowment funds are not eligible to be used for operations if they even have an endowment. So they're going to start cutting programs. They're going to stop buying new books. They're going to stop buying the e-books and the audiobooks that have become very popular as a result of COVID. And unfortunately, on the staffing side too, they may not fill any vacant positions, and they continue to not really pay staff very competitive wages. It's really kind of a sad thing. And then they will start reducing hours if the budget impasse continues.
Now, you mentioned previous impasses and how libraries survived during those. Spotlight PA reported that the most recent protracted budget impasse was the 2015-2016 state budget that was delayed for 9 months. What did libraries do during that time?
They absolutely cut services, programs, books, and staff and reduced hours. And, just 2 years ago, we also had the struggle where the budget didn't get done, and even the main parts of the budget got done in October. But the distribution language for library funding didn't get done till December. And so they didn't get money until January or February. And that is really, I've talked to several library systems who have said they were out of operational funds by the time that check came in from the state. They had used up all of their operational funds, and they were really close to making some really dire decisions. And the challenge is once you make that decision to cut something, in the nonprofit world, it is very hard to restart it. You've lost the momentum, you've lost a good price point if you went from having really competitive pricing for the books that you were buying or the services, the databases. Once you say, I can't pay for the whole year in full, and you've moved on to monthly, it's no longer you have that great price option.
Now, do libraries receive any funding from the federal government at all?
So individual libraries typically do not. But the state, the Office of Commonwealth Libraries, does receive $5 million from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The Institute of Museum and Library Services is the only federal entity that gives money to libraries nationally. That money does provide a lot of supportive services for libraries, both in terms of advising staff at the state level, but also it provides programs like professional development, which they need to have to maintain their credentials to be a professional librarian in Pennsylvania. So they have to take various continuing education. There's also support that is offered through statewide power library services. There's also what we call an ILS, which is the software that you use as a patron to check out books. So that catalog of books, so you know what the library has, some of that is paid for with dollars in part, not in full, that come from the federal level to the state and then out to statewide service providers. So libraries, when they don't receive that federal money too, we're also looking at reduction in those types of services and access.
And what would happen if things like the catalog or the training was not funded by the government?
Yeah, I've been in this position since 2016, and it may surprise you to know that even at that point, we did have libraries who did not have software that had the catalog, and they still had the very paper card catalogs that some people are very nostalgic about. But the reality is that most have moved to software, and that allows us to see what the library has. And that accessibility is important for all of us who are busy, senior citizens who may not be able to drive to the library themselves, and being able to log on a computer and see, oh, the library has the books that I'm looking for, place a hold, and then pick them up when it's convenient for them, or they register for a story time for their youngest learners, which is really important as we need to increase our literacy skills here in Pennsylvania. But that software and that access to professional development, and it makes sure that we are providing the books, but also the connection to how we can improve ourselves through reading. Both children who are just learning, as well as adults who need to perhaps learn more about how to get a mortgage or purchase their first home or how much debt is good. There are those types of access points that are really important. And if we see funding issues, it's a struggle that's going to impact folks in an incremental way, but in a dramatic way.
The federal budget bill was passed on July 4th. Was anything in there going to affect libraries at all?
So unfortunately, the proposal from the president was to zero out and close the Institute of Museum and Library Services on the federal level. There has been a subcommittee who voted in this process to restore that funding. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's going to make it across the finish line. So on the federal level, we, as well as our other colleagues across the country, are advocating for federal restoration of the Institute of Museum and Library Services and that funding, which are called grants to states.
You mentioned political support from people in, the government. How have you been lobbying for this funding, and do you have any specific Pennsylvanian government officials who really back libraries?
The great thing about libraries is it's generally not one side or the other. Everybody loves libraries and generally has positive, nostalgic stories of when they were a child and they went to the library. Although not all families take their kids to the library, and not everybody had access to a school library, unfortunately. But many adults do have positive memories of libraries. So we acknowledge that. And we acknowledge that libraries are part of the educational system overall. I mentioned, our early 0 to 5 learners who are really oftentimes getting that spark by going to a library program where there's a story time and the librarian who's trained on how to make the story interesting and engaging is also a role model for the adults. But what that means for the legislators is they see that piece of it as part of education. But what they may not recognize is that value for our seniors who come together. And this might be a senior who's living alone or independently and has lost family members or lives far apart. And the library is a community space where they can gather and talk with other neighbors without any pressure to buy anything. So, regardless of your budget or your finances, the library financially is an easy place to go where it's friendly. There's a lot of variety of books and materials. There are computer access. And so, even just using a library computer to check Facebook or send messages to family and friends who may be living elsewhere, that connection to the community is really important. It's also a place where, as we tell our legislators, it's where civic dialogue happens, right? When we connect with our neighbors, we have the opportunity to perhaps express different viewpoints on things, but in a safe way, but in a meaningful way. And I hope that our legislators are taking note of that right now as we hope they will come together to discuss. They have to all work together to pass this budget. It can't just be one side or the other. So at the beginning of the year, we had asked our legislators for more money. Right now, our advocacy push on the state level is simply get the budget done. Uncertainty is not good for library funding, and it is not good for nonprofits who have very limited budgets and really don't have the ability to just keep fronting money without knowing if they're going to get money back, get their reimbursements, and whether or not they're going to continue operations. So we're asking our legislators, we ask our library directors, we also ask our patrons. So if you are a library card holder, please contact your legislator and ask them to get the budget done so that libraries can get their funding on time.
Are there any alternate ways for libraries to receive funding, if not through any government plan?
You know, I do want to recognize, I mentioned earlier that state funding is generally 15 to 18% of a library's budget. That municipal funding is really important. So whether it's the boroughs, the townships, or the counties, unfortunately, not all municipalities contribute to a library, but that municipal funding is really important. And some libraries have gone in this state budget impasse and asked for additional funding from their townships and their counties. Regrettably, those municipalities are also in the same boat that they are waiting for money from the state budget, so they don't necessarily have the extra to provide as well. And the other individual grants here or there, many libraries have already been applying for those over the years and are often used for special programs and equipment. So it's not like there's a whole lot of extra sitting around somewhere. But I will say that if everybody contributes to a quality library, it really does make a difference in the community. Because we've certainly seen some libraries that are struggling, where there's not a lot of local financial support. And the state does have some equalization aid that hopes to level that out. But the reality is, it does take money to run a library. They don't just run for free. And we want quality libraries to support reading and literacy. We did the math, Ellen, at 70.47 million in the state budget and well over 4 million cardholders. Really, it's only $17 per cardholder that we're paying. So we'd like to increase that, but at a minimum, we'd like to get the budget done.
You mentioned at the beginning of the interview taxpayers funding some libraries. If this impasse were to happen longer, would the taxes go up for the people who have to pay for them?
Not necessarily. Generally, if they are a municipal library and not a nonprofit, that municipality might have a millage, and that was usually based on a voter referendum, and it approved a minimum level. So most municipalities, if the budget impasse continues, are balancing, libraries and other needs in their communities. So it's not a guarantee that there's more money coming. There are libraries who are asking for more, who maybe have struggled in the past, and there may be some voter referenda issues out there. Well, we hope that the community says, yes, I want a library, and I want a quality library, and I understand that they need some consistent funding and stable funding to make that happen.
Lastly, in May, the brown and white paper at Lehigh University published a quote from a library patron who says he agrees with the federal government's ruling on potentially cutting funds for libraries because, quote, a lot of people don't come into a library like that anymore because all the information is available at your fingertips, end quote. How, as a library professional, do you respond to that?
Well, I think they're missing a couple of pieces to that awareness. One, not every book is online. And in fact, a lot of books are not online or digital. So there's a lot of quality reading, both historical reading, classic literature that is not available digitally and is only available in a library. Two, recognizing that not everybody who is a reader is going to be able to pay for all the books that they want to read. If you can purchase a book online, sure, but not everybody can. And if you're a big reader, you certainly can't afford to buy books all the time. Plus, you run out of the space to house them because even libraries run out of that space. But there's also a lot of knowledge and other program materials. I mentioned earlier the libraries being community spaces. So, where else do you go to talk with your neighbors? Where else can you go to perhaps print? Many people don't have printers anymore, and not all communities have a retail option to print out your vehicle registration, to print out your tax information so that you can file your taxes. So, what's online is also there's a lot of misinformation. If you Google something, it's not guaranteed that it was truly researched and vetted information, and particularly on the health side, that's a concern. As we see a lot of AI generated material, even AI generated books and resources, that's just kind of reducing down bits and pieces here or there that they throw together. It's not a guarantee that it is vetted information that you want to follow.
We've been speaking with Christi Buker, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Library Association. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Ellen. And remember, September is Library Card Sign Up Month. Hope you have yours.